Some people smile at you and still hope you fail. What if I told you the more you grow, the more invisible enemies you create, and most of them will never admit why? Think about it. You've walked into a room and felt it, that subtle shift. The silence that wasn't there before. The glances that last a second too long. No one says anything. No one needs to. Because hatred, in its most dangerous form, is quiet. It does not shout. It observes. It judges. And most importantly, it hides. You assume people dislike you because of something you did, a mistake, a flaw, something fixable. But the truth is far less comforting. The first idea, that people project their insecurities onto you, operates quietly but powerfully beneath everyday interactions. Most individuals carry unresolved doubts about themselves, fears of inadequacy, feelings of not being enough, or hidden shame about their own limitations. These inner tensions are uncomfortable to face directly, so instead of confronting them, the mind looks outward for relief. It finds a target, often someone who unintentionally embodies what they lack or fear, and transfers those uncomfortable feelings onto that person. You might notice this when someone criticizes you for being arrogant, when you are simply confident, or distant, when you are just focused. The label they give you often reveals more about their internal struggle than your actual behavior. Your confidence may highlight their insecurity. Your discipline may expose their procrastination. Your clarity may irritate their confusion. Instead of acknowledging these feelings, they reshape the narrative so that you become the problem. This projection allows them to protect their self-image. If they admit that your strengths reveal their weaknesses, they would have to confront change, responsibility, or discomfort. By assigning negative traits to you, they avoid that internal conflict. In their mind, you are not a mirror. You are a distortion that needs to be dismissed or diminished. What makes this dynamic especially difficult is that it is rarely conscious. People genuinely believe their judgments are accurate. They feel justified in their dislike, unaware that the source lies within themselves. This creates a subtle tension where you may feel misunderstood or unfairly judged without clear reason, as if you are being evaluated by standards you never agreed to. The second idea, that your growth reminds others of their stagnation, touches a deeper psychological discomfort that many people struggle to admit, even to themselves. Growth is rarely neutral in social spaces. When you begin to evolve, whether through discipline, new habits, emotional maturity, or ambition, you unintentionally create a contrast. And contrast forces comparison. Someone who once felt equal to you may now feel left behind, not because you have directly challenged them, but because your progress silently asks a question they may not be ready to answer. Why haven't I changed? That question carries weight. It implies responsibility, effort, and the possibility that they have settled into patterns they could have outgrown. Rather than confronting that realization, it is often easier to redirect the discomfort outward. This is where subtle resentment begins to form. Your success is reframed as luck. Your discipline becomes obsession. Your change is labeled as inauthentic or trying too hard. These interpretations act as psychological shields, protecting them from the painful acknowledgement of their own inaction. By minimizing your growth, they preserve their current identity without having to challenge it. There is also a sense of loss involved. As you grow, your priorities shift. You may spend less time in environments or conversations that once defined your connection with others. To them, it can feel like abandonment or rejection, even if your intention is simply alignment with your new direction. Instead of expressing that vulnerability, it may come out as criticism or distance. In this way, your growth becomes a silent disruption, not because it harms anyone directly, but because it exposes the gap between what people are and what they could become. And not everyone is willing to face that gap honestly. The third idea, that authenticity unsettles those living behind masks, emerges from the tension between who people are and who they feel they must pretend to be. Many individuals move through life carefully constructing versions of themselves designed to gain approval, avoid rejection, or maintain control over how they are perceived. These masks can take many forms: confidence that hides insecurity, agreeableness that suppresses true opinions, or success that conceals emptiness. Over time, the mask becomes so familiar that it feels necessary for survival. When someone appears who is genuinely authentic, who speaks honestly, acts in alignment with their values, and does not constantly seek validation, it disrupts this fragile balance. Your authenticity does not directly attack them, yet it exposes the effort behind their performance. It highlights the gap between who they present and who they truly are. That exposure creates discomfort because it raises an unspoken question. Why am I not living like this? Instead of embracing that question, many instinctively resist it. They may interpret your authenticity as arrogance, bluntness, or even rebellion. Your refusal to conform to unspoken social expectations can feel threatening because it challenges the rules they have been following to feel safe or accepted. If those rules are not absolute, then their sacrifices, silence, compromise, self-denial, begin to feel unnecessary or even regrettable. There is also an element of fear. Authenticity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability carries risk. Seeing someone live openly can remind others of the courage they have avoided. Rather than stepping into that discomfort, they may distance themselves or subtly criticize you to reaffirm the safety of their own mask, preserving the identity they have built while quietly resisting the truth your presence reveals. The fourth idea, that unspoken competition breeds silent resentment, operates beneath the surface of most social environments, where people are constantly, though often unconsciously, measuring themselves against others. This comparison is rarely declared openly, yet it shapes how individuals perceive status, worth, and identity. Whether in friendships, workplaces, or social circles, there exists an invisible scale where people assess who is more successful, more admired, more capable, or more influential. When you begin to stand out in any of these areas, you may unknowingly shift that balance. Someone who once felt secure in their position may now feel challenged, even if you have no intention of competing. Your achievements, confidence, or recognition can be interpreted as a threat to their place within that silent hierarchy. Because this competition is unspoken, it cannot be addressed directly. Instead, it manifests as subtle tension. This is where resentment takes root. It is not loud or confrontational, it is quiet and controlled. Compliments may carry a hint of insincerity. Support may feel conditional. There may be a reluctance to fully acknowledge your progress or a tendency to downplay it. These reactions are not always deliberate acts of hostility, but rather defensive responses to a perceived shift in relative standing. What makes this dynamic more complex is that people often tie their self-worth to these comparisons. If they see themselves as falling behind, it can create feelings of inadequacy or even humiliation. Rather than confronting those feelings internally, they may project them outward, framing you as overly competitive, attention-seeking, or undeserving. This allows them to protect their sense of identity without openly admitting the comparison that triggered the discomfort. If any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, pause for a second and ask yourself, who have I been shrinking for, just to stay liked? And if you're ready to stop doing that, stay with me. The fifth idea, that boundaries are often perceived as arrogance, comes from how uncommon and misunderstood personal limits can be in many social dynamics. When you begin to define what you will and will not tolerate, you disrupt expectations that others may have grown comfortable with. People who are used to your availability, your compliance, or your silence may interpret your change not as self-respect, but as rejection. Saying no, choosing distance, or refusing to engage in certain behaviors forces others to adjust. And that adjustment can feel uncomfortable or even threatening. Instead of recognizing your boundaries as a healthy assertion of identity, they may label you as cold, selfish, or superior. This reaction often reflects their reliance on your previous openness, where your lack of limits benefited them in some way. There is also an emotional undertone. Boundaries create separation, and separation can be mistaken for judgment. When you stop over-explaining, stop seeking approval, or stop accommodating everything, it removes the reassurance others once relied on. In that absence, they may construct their own explanation, one where your restraint becomes arrogance, because it is easier than accepting that your behavior is no longer centered around their expectations. The sixth idea, that envy disguises itself as criticism or indifference, reveals how people mask uncomfortable emotions to protect their self-image. Envy is difficult to admit because it places someone in a position of perceived inferiority. To avoid that feeling, the mind reshapes envy into something more acceptable, often without conscious awareness. Instead of openly acknowledging admiration mixed with discomfort, a person may begin to criticize what they secretly desire. Your success becomes overrated. Your efforts are labeled unnecessary. Your achievements are reduced to luck or timing. These judgments are not random. They are subtle attempts to reduce the gap between you and them without requiring personal change. Indifference can function in a similar way. When someone acts as though they do not care about your progress, it can be a defense against caring too much. By pretending something holds no value, they protect themselves from confronting why they have not attained it. This creates a detached attitude that appears neutral, but often carries hidden tension. What makes disguised envy particularly complex is its inconsistency. The same person who downplays your success may still observe you closely, comparing quietly while maintaining a surface-level dismissal. The seventh idea, that you trigger traits in others they refuse to confront, relates to the way human perception often works like a mirror, reflecting back not just who you are, but what others suppress within themselves. People carry aspects of their personality they are not fully comfortable acknowledging. Insecurity, jealousy, laziness, fear, neediness, or even ambition they feel guilty about. When they encounter someone whose behavior highlights these traits, it can create internal discomfort. For example, your discipline may expose their inconsistency. Your honesty may expose their tendency to avoid difficult truths. Your emotional control may highlight their volatility. These comparisons are not always deliberate or logical, but they are felt. Instead of recognizing that the discomfort originates internally, it becomes easier to associate it with you. This is where projection deepens. Rather than saying, "I feel insecure when I see this," a person may think, "There is something wrong with this person." You become the external container for internal tension they do not want to process. In doing so, they preserve their self-image while avoiding self-examination. What makes this dynamic subtle is that it often appears as irritation or judgment without clear cause. They may not fully understand why your presence or behavior affects them so strongly, only that it does. That unresolved discomfort then influences how they treat you, even when the real conflict is happening within them, not between you and them. The eighth idea, that not being easily controlled makes you quietly disliked, comes from how deeply people rely on influence, even in subtle relationships. Control does not always mean direct authority. It often appears as expectations, emotional pressure, social conditioning, or unspoken rules about how someone should behave. Many social bonds are maintained through predictable responses, where people feel secure because they can anticipate or shape your reactions. When you stop being easily influenced by guilt, approval, or emotional manipulation, You disrupt that sense of predictability. You no longer react in the expected way. You do not over-explain when questioned. You do not chase validation when ignored. And you do not bend under pressure just to maintain comfort. This independence can create discomfort in others, especially in those who are used to subtle control dynamics working in their favor. Because they cannot easily steer your behavior, they may begin to interpret your independence as stubbornness, emotional coldness, or superiority. In reality, what they are reacting to is the loss of influence. When someone can no longer be shaped by unspoken expectations, it forces others to adjust their approach, and that adjustment can feel like rejection or resistance. Over time, this can lead to quiet dislike, not necessarily expressed openly, but felt in tone, distance, or subtle exclusion. It is less about who you are and more about the fact that you no longer respond in ways that keep others emotionally comfortable or in control of the dynamic. So when you put all of this together, a clearer pattern starts to emerge. What often feels like being disliked, judged, or quietly resisted is not always a reflection of your flaws, but a reflection of what you activate in others. People rarely respond only to who you are on the surface. They respond to what your presence stirs within them. Comparison, discomfort, admiration they cannot admit, or insecurities they have not resolved. This is why perception becomes so distorted. One person may see your confidence as arrogance, another may see your discipline as pressure, and someone else may see your boundaries as rejection. Yet none of these labels fully describe you. They describe the internal lens through which you are being viewed. And that lens is shaped by personal fears, unspoken competition, and emotional blind spots that most people never examine directly. The uncomfortable truth is that being misunderstood is often part of being visibly different. Growth, authenticity, and independence naturally create contrast in environments where many are still negotiating their own identity. And contrast, by its nature, creates tension. But understanding this changes your position in it. You stop taking every reaction personally. You stop shrinking to reduce discomfort in others. And you stop assuming that approval is the ultimate measure of alignment. Instead, you begin to see that not every judgment is about your character. Sometimes it is about someone else's internal conflict meeting your external reality.